So welcome to our first CMC podcast. Today's roundtable discussion is going to be on training competencies, specifically how training and techniques kind of merge together to determine what's appropriate for departments or teams that don't have the opportunity to train as often. And we'll go ahead and we'll get started here. We'll introduce our participants in the podcast. Kelly Byrne.
Hey, my name is Kelly Byrne. I'm a CMC rescue school instructor. I'm a fireman in Washington, D.C., where I've been there for over 20 years, the past 17 at Rescue 2. Prior to that, I was an airborne infantryman in the 82nd Airborne, and I'm also a current Level 3 SPRAT rope access technician and just a general all-round rope and rescue geek.
My name is Wayne Chapman. I currently serve as a director at CMC Rescue School. Prior to that, I retired 2 years ago from the Orange County Fire Authority down in Southern California, where I spent a total of 33 years. I started as a paid-on-call back in 1985. Got hired full-time in 1989. Did all sorts, but like most guys, went through the ranks. I served as a paramedic until I figured I couldn't walk on water. Promoted to captain, spent most of my career as a company officer. Spent 9 years in air operations on our ICS Type 2 helicopter, water dropping, night vision goggle hoist capable aircraft. And I was also a rigger on our FEMA Task Force, California Task Force 5.
My name is John McKinley. I'm not a firefighter. I'm a technical rescue specialist as a reserve deputy with Los Angeles County Sheriff. So we're a mountain rescue team, been doing that for 46 years. I am an instructor with CMC Rescue, have been for the last 25 years, primarily doing rope, confined space, and some specialized rescue classes that we get calls to do.
Thanks, John. And I'm Doug McLemore. I'll be the moderator today. I'm a CMC Rescue School instructor in both rope and confined space. I retired 3 years ago from the Pleasant Prairie Fire and Rescue Department in southeast Wisconsin. We're a smaller combination department. I started as a fire medic there and worked my way through and retired as the fire chief. Prior to that, I was a volunteer fire department. A volunteer in a county department that was in a very rural area, and then was also a paid-on-call member in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, which is a small tourist town in southeast Wisconsin. I also was actively involved with the technical rescue teams in the area, both in Kenosha County, Wisconsin, and in Lake and McHenry County, Illinois. And what we want to do is we want to talk specifically about training and techniques that are appropriate for departments or teams that don't have the opportunity to train very often. So why don't we get things started by talking with them, kind of the most basic of rescues, a top-down rescue.
One thing I like to tell all clients, students, is I'm a firm believer in what I call defined competencies. In other words, you have a list of required knots and skill sets. That way that everybody knows what's expected of them. So if it's a figure eight family of knots, if you're packaging into a sked or a LSP, whatever it is, the employer has an expectation of the employee, and the employee knows what's expected of them, and they practice those defined skills.
How do those get determined on, is it based by the department and their history on the kinds of rescues they do? Or do they get that from somewhere else, from a standard or something like that?
Yeah, in my experience, what I've done is typically as the class rolls on, I like to have the skills written down on the board. So we'll say, hey, okay, guys, you know that a water knot is used to make an anchor out of webbing. So there's a defined competency. If you're going to use the MPD, how to rig, lower, and raise using the MPD, those become defined competencies. If you use a certain type of mechanical advantage, those are defined competencies, and so on.
Absolutely. We do that too. Where I work, we've got defined competencies. Guys have to take a test to ride the technical rescue unit, and you get the list of competencies when you first get there, and a information book on how to do it all with a time standard and critical fails if you mess it up, similar to the Spratt standard. We've adopted some of that thought process just into our defined competencies for just the initial test, and then ongoing proficiencies would be similar to the initial test.
And that's interesting too, because to train people up front is one thing, but to maintain competency is another. So how would you look at the difference in these competencies for rescuer-based versus team-based for a top-down rescue?
So I know for me, we start with rescuer-based stuff. I think, a team-based operation. Like, I think rescuer-based operations seem to be more knowledge intensive of the individual rescuer. You can do more with less, certainly, but you definitely have to have a better skill set, or a more well-honed skill set before you start doing rescuer-based rescues. But I think the initial top-down kind of rescue, we always default to a team-based operation for our initial training, and then just as time goes on, we start adding more skills that allow the rescuer a little more latitude in what they want to do on the end of the rope. So we start team-based top-down as our initial start point, and then we end up as a rescuer-based, I think, towards the end of the journey, if there is one.
Okay. So Wayne, what are your thoughts?
So I guess I would subdivide that by saying, are we talking about the fire service, or are we talking about an industrial brigade? For example, fire service staffing seems to be a little bit more hardy. We've all done those classes at petrochemical plants, et cetera, where the midnight shift has 2 rescuers on duty. So rappel-based or individual-based rescues are all they can do. If they have more adequate staffing, then obviously team-based becomes much more safer and easier to teach in the long run and keep those core skills refined.
So how about John, with your mountain rescue background? I
was going to ask the same question when Kelly's talking, because coming from a robust municipal department, and then the whole industry question, Wayne brought that up already. But the thing about the industry is you don't have to be everything to everybody all the time. And then we say this in confined space as well. They know all their spaces, they know their hazards, or they know everything that's inside of the fence. And so this is where it comes up, where you have, petro or chemical plant, whatever it is, they know what processes are going on and what's likely to happen. That 2-person rescue team in the middle of the night on some industrial plant knows their primary rescue, other than medical, of course, would be probably some sort of fall into fall protection or something like that, where an operator is going around doing their job or something, where you're not going to have as likely to be as complicated. And it's something that they can pre-plan, where they can go, we have this kind of hazard, and rescue for fall protection is the primary one in that case, other than confined space or something. But they have we're talking more about rope, but they have the chance to pre-plan their operations and dial them in, and be able to accomplish them with a short or a small staffing. That a fire department has to be everything to everybody everywhere, and they don't have that problem. They've got the more robust rescue team, and obviously in the bigger municipal departments, they probably have a more robust training program.
So, and Kelly, someone alluded to it here too. So, Wayne, what are your thoughts on maintaining proficiency of rescuer-based versus team-based?
Well, again, I think this goes back to me for the defined competencies. If you have a specific set of skills that every individual rescuer is required to know based on hazards at their particular facility, obviously talking industrial, then those people know what's expected of them based on their particular hazards. Obviously, the fire service, much more all risk, coming across a wider array. Those defined competencies are by far and large a bigger pot, if you will. Whereas in the industrial world, what we call inside the fence, they know their particular problems, where they're going to occur, and how to rig for those types of rescues. So But I think it all goes back for me to the defined competencies.
Okay, so let's kind of switch it up then. Let's talk about a bottom-up rescue. More kind of like a tower type rescue. Well, Kelly, what are your thoughts there from a training competency standpoint?
So I lean heavily on my rope access background for how to do bottom-up rescues. As long as you understand the concepts of work positioning and fall arrest, however you get to that point, be it with a two rope system and Y lanyards or Grion and Y lanyards, or however you do it, I think just maintaining the concept of fall arrest and work positioning is the important part for the training for us. From the bottom up kind of rescue, we were, again, I'm speaking from a municipal fire department standpoint. It's just not something we do where I work that often. When we've been presented with it, we haven't done an outstanding job or even a good job. But it definitely drove home the point that we were not prepared for it. One, because we didn't have, as Wayne mentions, the defined competencies. Some people have been pushing for it for a while, and it finally bit us. But now it's a real problem. People can get stuck on towers. We didn't have the equipment, so we bought that, and we've updated our training program internally to account for these type of rescues and to harp a little bit on rope access techniques as they relate to a municipal fire department. They're not, not all rope access skills are appropriate or needed for every fire department, but certainly I think there's stuff to be learned there. And we've definitely taken some of those skills and have been starting to implement them. So, just picking what the hazards in your area. We've got a bunch of tower cranes and antennas. So we started looking at lead climbing and lowering people from those. And we needed equipment and just a better way of thinking about it. So we redefined what the competencies were and have been making progress on that.
Okay, John, what are your thoughts?
Well, I had kind of a question, and Kelly was speaking that it came to mind to me on that. I know you're a rope access technician and you have those skills, and so you've mentioned that and you certainly have them. Is that something that you view as a way that your department or others should be going more to that direction, or do you think that the traditional team-based training that isn't so much rope access based, because there's some differences, are valid? In other words, are you the only rope access guy in the department, or are there others there, and do you see yourselves looking towards that for more training as a direction?
Yeah, so we've got a few rope access guys on the job where I work. Not as many are into it as I am. I don't see it as an either or situation. I see it as in addition to. I don't start my guys on a rescuer-based rope access type of course initially. We start with the Teambased, twin tension, 2 Z-rigs, litter attendant, the usual stuff. And as they get more proficient at that, we start adding a little bit of individual skills on rope, ascending and descending a rope. So, for instance, the department where I work, we in our level 1 rope class, our 5-day rope class, we do ascending and descending rope access style with, chest descender, handle descender, and a backup device on a separate rope. I don't know that we would use that. I don't think it's a direct translation one-to-one from a fire department rescue into, rope access, ascending and descending. But what I think it does is gives people a better understanding of what's going on in their rope system and how they can solve problems, at a pretty low level themselves. You've got nobody else but yourself when you're doing rope access stuff, to solve the problem on your rope, hopefully. But it lets people, it gives them a broader perspective of what's capable. Where I'm at, we show up with 15 technicians on a rope call. It's too many, to be honest. But to have individual skills, I think is important as you walk down the path of being a rope geek. It's just more tools in the toolbox. It's not appropriate for everything, but it sure helps when it's necessary.
So, I know, Wayne, you had talked, in the last topic about some of the inside the fence type and industrial situations. So how would that apply here
Well, for example, I just recently had a client where they do tower work, and as it currently stands, they only send 2 people out to work on the tower. It's what that organization does, public or private entity. So what we came up with was having the initial worker climb with bypass lanyards, but he also brought the ends of both ropes with him. And he rigged those ropes up for rescue. He then came down to his position and did his work. Then what would happen is we would simulate an incident. The worker was trained, call for help via their radio system, and then the second worker, who became the rescuer, climbed up the tower using his ASAP as fall arrest, got to the point, put a clutch on, rappelled down, and did a rappel-based pickoff, and the whole thing took less than 5 minutes because they were prepared for the incident, and that ended up becoming the way they do it, and it was very quick because they took that into consideration. We're talking about people that rescue is not their primary job in life, and a lot of times when people who aren't trained in rescue see things happen, a lot of their skills, they've just never seen this stuff before, so they kind of get into this panic. So having everything pre-rigged certainly helps them to have to not to remember so many things, to just get that person to the ground.
And let's kind of talk about, too, whether it be, because that would be excellent if all people working in those scenarios could rig for rescue in advance. But unfortunately, especially like fire service-based rescue, we're not going to have that luxury most of the time. So then we're going to be looking at, are we going to be basing the rescue off the tower, or is it going to be a ground-based operation? So, John, what are your thoughts about about tower versus ground-based?
Well, obviously, if the victim, or the worker that you're looking at hasn't rigged for rescue, you're getting called, and if they're already set up rigged for rescue, you're not going to get there in time. It's going to be over, which is the ideal situation. It's like you're there for medical and the rescue's already been done. And remember, in the case of any specialized rescue domain, they're in their environment. I mean, these guys climb towers every day or every week, whatever they do. And, we don't, in public safety, do some of these exotic environments as often. But I think because we have the manpower, and it all depends on the height of the tower and things like that, there's so many variables, it's hard to say. But if it's not rigged and you're starting over again, assuming a reasonable height, and by that I mean like 150 feet or less, it's probably going to be faster to be ground-based for us because we're not going to have the familiarity with the climbing techniques. We might be climbing with a bypass lanyard. It's easier to climb up, do a drop line, pull some pulleys up, and run it that way, where the rescuer, one individual isn't responsible for doing everything because, again, it isn't their environment, and they can have both hands free, if you will. And, again, height, tower, there's all kinds of considerations with everything, but I think generally on the public safety side, they're going to be going ground-based.
Okay. So Kelly, all things being equal as far as height, where both are practical, do you have a preference on tower versus ground-based?
No, I think it really depends on the guys who show up for the call. I kind of agree with John. If it's a lower height, 150 or less is probably a good benchmark. With your 400-foot ropes, you could accomplish it. Bottom up is probably the way to go. Clip 2 ropes to a guy and send him up with 2 pulleys and just, let him just set the high change of direction and let the ground crew do all the grunt work. Anything above that, you're probably going to be, forced by necessity of rope length just to do a tower-based rescue. But again, it depends on the guys. It depends on the training. Bottom up is easier for most. I think for most municipal firemen, a tower-based would definitely be, a default for, a nerdy rope access guy, I think. And rightfully so. To each one is in their strong suit. You're going to have less problems with a fire department guy doing ground-based than if you tried a tower-based rescue, I think, for the most part.
Wayne, any thoughts there as far as continued competency?
No, I mean, I look at my previous fire department employer. We showed up with 18 rope technicians, plus the host of various, operations level folks. And Groundbased was almost always the go-to because we had 600-foot ropes.
Yeah, it's an easy. Yes, most of them probably are better ground-based and quicker and safer. A recent tower incident we had, the guys just got sucked into a ground-based rescue, or a ladder-based rescue. They were going to go up an aerial ladder. Like, they had all their eggs in the Plan A basket, and when the ladder was 30 feet too short, they were hours behind on their Plan B with no set of skills even in their data banks of how to do a tower-based climbing rescue on this. It was a massive tower, but real big spaces between the spans. So it was just totally outside of anybody's thought process to go do a tower-based rescue on that. All the eggs were in the climb up an aerial ladder, set up a high point near the guy, and we'll get him. But it didn't work out that way.
So, basically the rescues we've talked about, up till now have been, pretty straightforward, like a pick-off type, rescue. You're really not using tenders. You're not using a lot of patient packaging equipment or anything. So if we transition over to a little bit more complicated, whether it be, litter-based or some other type of patient packaging device where you may or may not need an attendant with. So starting with a lowering system, John, what are your thoughts there from a training standpoint to keep people competent? Any preferences?
Well, it comes down to you've got to train for the kind of environment that you have, and this is where it pretty much comes together that people might be training for high altitude rescues or high angle rescues that they're never going to have, and obviously if their rescue calls consist primarily of cars over the bank or something like that, they've got to do lowering, and they may not have to do raising. It may be a matter of lowering down the rescue or packaging the patient and then lowering them further down and getting them out that way. It may involve converting to haul and bringing them back up to the roadway. Depends on the situation, but that lower angle litter work is so different than the high angle litter work, and if they're not doing that, then practice with what you need is, I guess, what it really comes down to. And keeping it as simple as possible. I know eventually we'll probably get into a little more on the systems now that we're talking about team-based rescue, but...
Yeah. So, Wayne, what are your thoughts?
Well, I guess I kind of agree with John here. We see a lot of people training for things they would never do, right? I'm a big advocate of, only train for the problems that you have. Now, in the fire service, those problems can be wide-ranging, right? But if you're a fire brigade or an ERT brigade at a local refinery, the odds of you having some of these scenarios don't exist. But they want to practice them, and they forget the skills or don't practice the skills often enough that they would have to do, like rescue from fall protection. Obviously, I think team-based rescues are definitely safer. It allows the rescuer to be hands-free, to be able to deal with the victim, whereas rappel-based scenarios require that repeller to, lock off, possibly package a patient, deal with some other things. So I do prefer team-based scenarios when possible.
Kelly, let's kind of dive a little bit more into the different types of systems out there. Do you have a preferred team-based system that you would use for a lowering system with a patient package and a packaging device, with or without a tender?
Yeah, our go-to is a litter-based operation if the patient needs it. Like more times than not, we're going to package somebody in a Stokes basket. We've got the CMC patient packaging system at work. I think it's just I hate to be a shill for it, but it's a pretty awesome system, and it's fast as all get out. So putting somebody in a Stokes basket and lashing them up with that, and then attendant or not, it really depends on the situation and the consequence of failure. So or what's going to happen to the basket. We ride tower crane hooks out all the time, and we put an attendant on that. So in a construction site, we've got the big old hammerhead tower cranes. We'll put 2 ropes over the hook down to our Stokes basket, and we'll put the patient and an attendant there. I don't know that an attendant is, ultra necessary, but like there's no risk. You're on a, multi-ton capacity crane, so it's really no big deal. The same building, if we're going on a building downtown in a city, can have, 2 different needs. On the front side of the building, flat glass wall or whatever, you could put a tagline from the street and pull them away, no big deal. If you had to lower on the backside where there's fire escapes, you're definitely going to need an attendant there. So, even the same building could have different requirements. But for us, more often than not, it is a litter-based operation with an attendant on it. And that's definitely the way we train more often than not, is litter-based with an attendant.
So, John, what are your thoughts as far as when we kind of get into the traditional systems like a dedicated main slack belay versus a TTRS system?
Obviously, that's kind of the hot topic or subject of discussion anyway right now. And we're seeing ourselves more going to the twin tension system. Our traditional rescues are primarily vehicle-based, truck cable with a rope belay. But we're in the backcountry. We've been going more to twin tension systems just for ease of operation. Tandem pressure belays certainly are competent, but they can be a problem. And we're blessed with MPDs and clutches now, so we can very easily work with a twin tension system. It's so much easier for training, and it's just easier for operations ourselves. So, we've been going to those, and there's arguments and discussions. I'm sure we'll get into some of that on one way they work and others, but we see ourselves going to that from the traditional loaded main slack belay.
And Wayne, from a training competency standpoint, what are your feelings on a traditional versus a TTRS?
I definitely think that TTRS is easier for teams to remember. In other words, we've seen it in the past where a guy don't understand that, hey, yeah, you're the main line through a brake bar rack and you're a tandem pressure belay and you got to do a certain thing. Nowadays with TTRS, both lines look identical the entire time, so both people do the exact same thing. I've definitely noticed in classes both contract and open enrollment, repeat versus first time customers, if you will, where it's easier to remember because each line looks exactly the same. Sometimes the only difference is the color of the rope.
Kelly, what are your experiences and what have you seen on as far as how many people are switching to TTRS or switching or staying with a traditional system?
Especially amongst you guys, it's no secret that I'm a twin tension rope system fan. But for the most part, going around and looking at what's out there, I think most places, if they're not TTRS crew already, they're certainly looking at it. I don't think it's as controversial or as unique as it was even just a few years ago coming out. But I got to agree with Wayne, and from just a training perspective, to have the same exact device, on a Teambased system for, what you would traditionally call a main line and a back, belay line, it's the same device. You only have to learn one skill, and it's the same device when you go to rappel as well. Like to have one device, speaking of the clutch in particular, that can do all 3 competently and meet, everybody's required, standards. I think it's pretty awesome. Especially if a guy's only touching rope a couple times a year. If they're on a rescue team at a refinery or a factory, they're not touching rope as often as they need to stay ultra competent. But if you can minimize how many different items they have to touch in order to be competent, I think it's a win. Again, I can speak to where I work. We've been a twin tension team for a good while with the MPDs. We just switched to clutches and G11 rope and small aluminum carabiners. Like for an urban department to be using 11 mil rope and small aluminum carabiners, like it's you'd think the universe is going to tear a hole in itself, but we've managed to survive.
have you seen many people, or do you still have departments or other teams in your region that are still using, like a traditional RPM type system, or have people switched over to newer devices like the clutches and MPDs?
I think most people have switched over to a twin tension. Mostly they are MPD based systems, but that's what I see around me. The mutual aid into to Washington D.C., which is where I work. We're a pretty insular department. Not many people come in, and we rarely go out. So we don't have to I don't get the chance to interface with other teams as much doing that in a work situation, but in a teaching environment, it's I think it's definitely the scales are tilting towards TTRS now.
And John, it kind of seems to be somewhat controversial, and there's definitely a lot of opinions out there in a TTRS system, whether you have two separate teams hauling on their individual lines, or if you have one team holding onto both lines. Well, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, one team hauling on both lines definitely solves the problem of the ropes moving at the same speed, because if the same team's pulling both ropes, they're naturally moving at the same speed. And that's where some of the opposition to the twin tension rope system comes. For instance, if you needed a 5-to-1 to haul the litter on a traditional loaded main slack belay, and instead you build a 3-to-1 on each system, as soon as one team's not pulling their load, the load doesn't move, because you can't do it with a 3-to-1. And having the teams grabbing both ropes solves that problem of coordination. The problem in the wilderness environment where I come from is that you can't always do that because of your anchor situation. If you have big bomber anchors, either a big tree or in an urban industrial situation with perhaps a structural member of some kind, it's easy to solve. But when you're tying off to a little wimpy bush, you don't want to put all your eggs on that one. And there's where it starts to be a little bit of a coordination problem, because anchors may not be right next to each other, and therefore the teams can't always pull together. I mean, you can do some pulleys and changes directions and things like that to do it, but in a wildland environment, we're oftentimes more limited on where we have a haul field, if you will, and we'll usually solve the problem and be able to pull on both ropes by putting in change of direction pulleys that allow both ropes to line up. And because lots of times our haul field is right down a trail or something like that because of the vegetation around it. I think if you can do it, having both ropes go together, and on the lowering system, it's the same way. That single tailer holding both ropes does coordinate things. And we don't have an issue usually. You don't have an issue with manpower for lowering. Somebody's working the clutches or the MPDs, somebody else is holding the ropes. That's not a problem.
Okay, yeah, Wayne, what are your thoughts, sir?
I'm obviously a huge advocate of TTRS, especially when the haul team can grab both ropes. I think it solves all sorts of problems. Like I said, rope speed is literally identical. Having said that, I've been quoted before as saying, never say never, never say always. And basically what I mean by that is, like John said, there are times when that can't happen. And that's when the technician needs to understand that, hey, look, if this team's walking faster than that team over there, it's not quite TTRS anymore, and just to be aware of it. But whenever possible, I'm a big advocate of having both ropes in the operator or operator's hands to make that speed truly match up.
If I could add something to that, as we work towards this, or as this became more popular, and in some industrial sites where you have high cracking towers, distillation towers, things like that, very limited room, and also limited anchors where you can only have one anchor in one location by their plant rules or whatever, have to emphasize that the anchors or the ropes need to be connected to the same place on the load. And we found this more on lowering systems with individuals where they are into fall protection mode and they insist on putting one rope to the dorsal connection and one rope to the front connection on the rescuer's harness. And when the anchors aren't in the same place and the ropes don't move at the same speed, that doesn't work. The load's going back and forth. The rescuer on the line is bobbing back and forth, and you have to connect to the same place. and it isn't a technique we use, but there are some teams that connect one rope to the head of the litter and one rope to the foot, and obviously there's always going to be a coordination problem with that. And both ropes need to go to the center of the litter rig. They need to go to the same connection point on the harness.
And then now something else that it kind of is getting thrown into the mix, and I think a great tool, but has to be used properly. And maybe Kelly, if you could address this, is some of the new the rope winches, like the Harkin Lockhead or others that are out there, and even have the possibility of even putting a power adapter on, like a half-inch drill. What are your thoughts there, Kelly?
Yeah, I don't actually have a whole ton of experience in the winching for rope world. I had a skyhook winch for a couple of years, personally, that I used occasionally. I think for some maybe limited manpower rescue teams, they're good. Again, rope access, they're awesome to get people and equipment up and down long spans, or up cables on cable stayed bridges. From a fire department urban rescue-based standpoint, I just don't have a lot of perspective with them. I can see that they're easy to use, and certainly when they're powered, it's way easy to use. But I don't have enough experience to speak intelligently one way or the other on them. They're definitely popular, they're definitely out there, but for a limited manpower, confined space kind of team and rope access, they can definitely prove their worth. But for the general rescue community, that's just switching from dedicated main, dedicated belay to a TTRS. A winch is a whole other ball of wax to try and absorb, I think. And I don't know how many teams are there yet. And I just don't have a whole ton of experience to be able to speak intelligently on it.
Yeah, if you switch into the winch, either hand or machine powered, you're pretty much back to the loaded main slack belay again, where the belayer's pulling the rope up and the winch is pulling the load. They're not going to be twin tensioned. And I suppose you could have two, that'd be nice, but is that really necessary? Probably not. So I haven't seen those being used a lot in the wilderness environment where I usually work. Cable winches and powered winches, I think, seem to be a little more popular in Europe in the past, but there's all kinds of other things. There was a lot more wire rope being used than fabric rope and things like that. I just haven't seen it being used a lot in this country recently. So, it's a bunch. The mountain rescuers tend to be lightweight. They might have to carry the stuff in a long distance, and I got to tell you, I have one of those battery-powered whole hogs, and it is a heavy beast. It's very nice, but carrying it in what might be miles is, I think there's other things I'd rather be carrying lots of times.
So, ultimately, all these topics and all these techniques and all these, and everything we've talked about really comes back to training. So, Wayne, what are your thoughts? So, a lot of teams and departments really have a hard time dedicating a lot of time to training. What are your thoughts of what can they do to maximize or increase the time that they have the opportunity to train in?
Well, this is, I guess, where I'm very fortunate. My previous fire department employer, training was a non-issue. We were given as much time as we needed to train. In fact, we were out of service quite a bit to do it. Now, what helped us immensely was going from the old brake bar rack tanaprosic belay systems to the twin MPDs. What that allowed us to do was then that skill set became, we could get rid of the tanaprosic belay, put together, or even the rack, and move up to the MPDs, which then allowed us to move up and spend more time doing the over-the-side things, if you will, pick-offs, that type of stuff. Industrial teams, same thing. If they can use devices like twin tension systems where the anchoring is always the same, MPD or a clutch or whatever they use, they can spend more time practicing, rescues from stranded pick-off rescues where you have a person in fall protection or whatever it is. But we used to see a lot of time wasted in the old days what I call back at the anchor with people during, basic, release hitches and all that stuff, and they could never get to the point of getting competent at the patient side.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kelly, what are your thoughts?
I think with the newer items out there that allow you to do a twin tension system, it gets people trained up to see the big picture much quicker, rather than being focused on individual small tasks. Wayne mentioned, the load releasing hitch, or getting just a million small items right before you can turn around and see what's actually going on with your system. I think throwing people into a twin tension system environment allows them to see big picture much better. So for instance, a pickoff, a team-based pickoff, rather, you lower somebody down, make your connections, raise them back up a little bit to release the weight off their system, and then lower them to the ground. Prior to a twin tension rope with something like the MPD or clutch or Maestro or ID or whatever, you'd be stuck lower, converting from a lower to a raise with the brake bar rack, a load release hitch, and then back again. That's a lot of individual skills to learn, versus just yanking rope through a full efficiency pulley kind of device. I think it gets people to see the big picture much quicker, and it spins people up to be competent rescuers much quicker. The other skills are still important if you forgot your MPD or whatever back at the truck, but I think the devices allow for much more hands-on training and grasping what's actually going on in a system much quicker than a traditional, dedicated main, dedicated belay system with all that entails.
Excellent. John, why don't you...
Well, I had a couple things when Kelly just said, and I certainly don't disagree at all. We're still teaching traditional systems in our beginning rope rescue technician classes, because we hear more often than not as like from the department, that's what we have and that's what I'm sent here to learn. But, with the, obviously not trying to shill or anything, but people need to realize that things have changed and that there are better ways to do it. And it is more efficient to go other ways for both training and for rescue operations. And, like I say, we still teach it, but I would like not to, except for the people that still say, I have to learn it, because that's what we have in our department, that's what we have in our county, our mutual aid response area, or whatever it is. It'd be nice to get away with it. My thing about the training is, and I think we've all said this one way or another earlier, is know your history and the kind of operations you're doing. And, the four of us are rope geeks, and we like doing all the fun stuff, and a lot of people do, but I see a lot of people that spend time training, and they will spend half a day or something doing a highline evolution that they don't have the conditions for in their area. And it's fun, and it builds confidence, and all those sorts of things. I understand those, but they really need to spend more time, or probably need to spend more time, sticking to their basics, that they have their kind of responses. And if they're low angle carryouts or something like that, I know it's kind of boring and you can't get to do all this fun stuff, but that really is something that they need to concentrate their training on, and not doing all the big rescues and the fun stuff that unfortunately they'll never have to do.
That makes sense. Well, thank you all for your participation in our first inaugural podcast here. And there should be more of these to follow on some other interesting topics.